everybody. Welcome to We the Parents podcast. This is episode 20, and I'm very excited for this 20th episode. My guest tonight, this evening is Dr. Jennifer Harman. Dr. Harman, you are a associate professor at Colorado State University, and you are one of, I guess, can I say, leading experts in parental alienation.
I guess so.
Are you allowed to take that as a compliment?
No, I'm pretty modest. I don't like to.
All right, I'm gonna make you unmodest, hopefully before the end of the show, because I'm gonna give you all your credit. But Dr. Harman, I usually let my guests introduce themselves because no one knows my guests better than themselves. So why don't you introduce yourself to this audience?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Dr. Jennifer Harman. I've been at Colorado State University since 2005. I started as an assistant professor, and then I got tenure and promoted to associate professor. I got my doctorate in social psychology from University of Connecticut, and then I have 2 master's degrees in psychological counseling from Teachers College at Columbia University. Currently, most of my research over the last 10 years has focused exclusively on the study of parental alienation. I also study other forms of domestic violence and family conflict, mostly looking at power and relationships. And I've looked at it in other areas of public health as well,
right?
Not just in this area, but my focus has changed a lot just on this topic, just because I think it's so important and we need a lot more research on it. And I'm also president of the International Council on Shared Parenting. I guess that's about all I got.
You are very modest, so I wish I should have done more research. If I didn't know you were so modest, I would have had a whole thing, because I'm sure there's tons of things. So you do have a few books out, is that correct?
I've published one book. It was mostly when I published it when I started getting into this area of research, because I was doing thorough literature review and getting familiar with the field. And so I published a book based on that review and kind of my impressions of the field coming at it from a social psychologist perspective. Because prior to that time, a lot of people who've been publishing on this are lawyers,
right,
or clinicians or other mental health providers who are working with families. And my approach is very different. I see things, I look at things systemically, and
right.
I kind of look at how institutions and other things influence people and their behaviors. And so my book kind of gave some of my first thoughts about alienation at the time. That was a few years ago. And since then, I just publish, about 2 to 4 papers on parental alienation a year in peer-reviewed journals. And that's been my primary goal, is just to get as much research out there as we can get.
Right. So, this is obviously a intimate subject matter to millions of Americans. And I feel like we're just now feeling like it's okay. Maybe it's due to social media or whatever is going on, where we're discussing this as a form of abuse, not only with a parent on parent or a parent to child, but as well as the system itself, who's sort of monetized and incentivized this type of abuse. Would you say, in your opinion, that the system has figured out a way to create a culture where this has grown over the last few decades?
I would say so. Our systems reflect us, right? They reflect who we are. We create these systems, so they sort of mirror the drama that plays out in our families, right? And when they're, and we can choose to design that differently. And we need to. We need to do some major court reform. And that's not easy, because changing institutions, it's not just court, right? We're dealing with CPS, police,
child support, foster care, everything.
Yes. There's so many systems that have to change, right, to make this work.
Yeah.
And one little piece could break and everything downstream is broken, right? So it's going to take a long time to, I think, fix that. But at least there's, I think, there's a growing movement and desire. People
Oh
are
yeah.
speaking up and wanting to put a spotlight on this and to try to find ways to change it. So,
Well, regular people like you and me, and even, I mean, when I say regular people, I mean, you know, just a dad. Like I'm just a dad, but I have a knack for speaking, and I'm a musician as well. And you know, we have these platforms and this technology that
mhm,
we're able to get our voices out at a much broader way. Where you know, this has been for decades been sort of something where you're almost shamed to not speak about, because let's be honest, if relationships ended, it's probably because both parties weren't perfect.
right.
And obviously, when you get into the parental alienation aspect of it, you're getting more into uh, typically it's one parent not being able to resolve emotional issues or
Mhm,
behave or has behavioral issues or some sort of personality disorder of some type.
right.
Now, you know, I want to talk a little bit because, you know, other than the work that you do, the only thing that I've read is that, you know, you have your own experience dealing with this personally. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. I kind of approach it from kind of both sides of this issue. Well, not both sides. One side from a parental alienation issue, but also as a victim of domestic violence.
Right.
I've, you know, I've been a victim of domestic violence, the father of my children, and fortunately, there were a lot of protections available to me and to my children. And unfortunately, you know, this is where I would get so angry with people who manipulate the system
Mm,
and make false allegations of abuse because it undermines protections for people who really do need it
right.
when they are abused. And I saw that then when I remarried. My husband was being alienated from his children before I even met him. And when I got involved, it just escalated, obviously,
Right.
as it often does. And
Sure.
I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know that there was something called parental alienation,
Yeah.
which
No,
is,
I.
yeah, which is odd too, because I'm a scientist and I study relationships. And how can I go through my whole training and publishing and reading so many papers on close relationships and never see that term? And
Well,
so I got
can
blown away by it when I was seeing what was going on and realizing how few people knew about it. And I was relieved to see it had a name. But then, well, I think probably like many parents, you're relieved to see that it's called something. You're like, yes.
right. Right. Right.
Then you get disappointed because you're like,
Because
well,
no.
wait, there's no solution for this. There's no
Yeah.
help, you know. So yeah, there's kind of a relief in knowing, but then there's this letdown. And that
Yeah.
letdown needs to change. You know, we need more stuff. And that's I've seen a lot of changes in just the brief time I've started doing this research. I'd say in the
Right.
last 10 years, it's very different than it
Right.
was, which is good. But we are getting a lot more resistance too. We're getting a
Sure.
lot of pushback from people who don't want to acknowledge that alienation's real or
Who
that
are those people? I always like to get all my guests to say who they
I just
are.
call them detractors. That's my
Ah,
name.
yeah. There's
They're a
two.
mix. They're a mix. A lot of them are attorneys who are advocates
Mhm.
who work to protect children from abusive fathers or mothers from abusive ex-husbands.
Mm,
Um, Not all. I mean, I work with domestic violence. You know, people who do research in this area. So not everybody who does work in this area is like this, but there are
right.
some, you know, pretty polar, like kind of extreme views on that, and they're very powerful. And you know, joining them are parents who've been found to be alienating their children and don't admit it. They think they're doing nothing wrong. So that's a lot of parents.
Yeah.
You know, for all the parents who are being alienated, there's a bunch of parents who are doing it, right? So
Yeah.
so they're kind of a lot of them are among the detractors. And then joining them too are some of the children who have not repaired the relationship with the parent, and they feel very justified in their rejection, not seeing the role that the other parent had in their rejection, and then their subsequent alienation from the parent. So those are kind of there's a large there's a diversity of people who are against alienation or
Yeah.
kind of have been being resistant towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do we do? What would you suggest for parents like me who are going through this battle and who know, based on the education that you help provide, that and we also try to pass it to the courtroom, and literally, not to speak in detail about my issue, but I use some of the things I learned. I spoke of some of the things that I learned from your YouTube videos, from your interviews, from Dr. Warren Farrell, from all these leading experts in this realm. And not only that, but we've had the science for decades now that
Mhm.
shows that, in particular, the lack of father involvement is causing a lot of the behavioral issues and societal issues and economic issues that we're facing today, which is the destruction of the family. It doesn't take it and someone who's gone and studied as much to just be able to absorb what you're saying. Look at the facts, and the evidence is, with divorce at 50% and kids being born out of wedlock at 40%, what's going on here?
Mhm.
And we can trace a lot of this back to, like you said, the system and domestic policy,
Mhm.
which is the Violence Against Women's Act, the No Child Left Behind, this culture that we've created, not only in our system but in our form of government, that's made, for the most part, and we do like to preface every time I do a show that parental alienation can be done by men or women. But the family courts take it a step
Mhm.
further, and they
Mhm.
allow it to be generated more and towards favor of the mother.
Mhm.
However, it does happen. There are instances where dad might know the judge, or they play
Mhm.
golf together, and
Mhm.
he's the one that wins. So
Mhm.
we do know, ladies, that it does happen, that the family courts do abuse men and women. Just the scale is so lopsided. So that's why we like to talk about it. But just the effects of fatherlessness and what it's doing to our society, where it's sort of injecting government as the dad and mom as the custodial parent, and the biological father as the income, just the
Mhm.
income,
Mhm.
with very minimum visitation, just to say, to justify that child support or whatever, um, because we can't just rip every father out of their kid's life, because that would look a little suspicious, I guess. So we designate fathers to an every other weekend scenario, or Disneyland dad scenario. So, in your situation, you were a victim of domestic violence,
Mhm.
and as you mentioned, that it did go in your favor because there were systems in place
Mhm.
that are there to protect women.
Right.
Would you speak on, just in your experience and opinion? Obviously, this isn't your field, but why do you believe that we don't have um, institutions and programs and court systems that protect men from women who exude domestic violence almost at the same rate? Men
Mhm.
and women are different in many ways, but women are physical, women are emotionally abusive, women,
Mhm.
why are we attacking men?
Mhm. Well, it's a very complicated question. Answer that question.
Sorry.
There's a gender paradigm about violence that is, that is very strong in the people who try to detract from parental alienation, and that gender paradigm involves, men as perpetrators and women as victims, and um, it kind of underlines every argument that goes against parental alienation, that goes against shared parenting. That's at the core of it,
Right.
and the and it's a powerful argument to make. It's anybody can scream, "I'm a victim," and and
Sure.
everyone just, nobody wants to say, accuse them of lying, right? No one
Sure.
wants to say you're, and so, when you hear people saying this, people will often say, "Oh, well, you don't want to challenge them," and so anyway, but that gender paradigm is the strongest piece of it, and it infiltrates policy, it infiltrates every, laws, and practices in institutions. And the gender bias, I mean, I've documented that in a lot of my research on stereotypes about men and women, and how
Mhm.
you know, behaviors of a man, when we say that they're abusive, tend to be believed more than. And for women, if we say that they're crazy, I mean,
Right.
you can use stereotypes against them too,
Sure.
and it sticks and it's hard to
Yeah.
come off. Or if a mother works a lot, then
Yeah.
she's seen as not a good parent, right? Um, and so, you know, one thing that we need to understand is that, you know, we call these behaviors like alienating behaviors,
Hmm.
but they're the same as coercive controlling behaviors.
Right.
They're not different. They're
Right.
just a different name. And the reason we give it a different name for people who study parental alienation is because we study how it affects kids.
Hmm.
So, you know, there's decades of research on domestic violence for both moms and dads showing it where they report their ex threatens to take their children away if they leave the relationship.
Hmm.
They threaten to hurt them. They use them as a weapon to spy. They describe all the same things that alienated parents describe.
Right.
And they say this to shelter workers. They say this to their therapists. They say this to, you know, anybody who researches them. There's lots of
Yeah.
documentation. And so when we all of a sudden label it parental alienating behaviors, we only give it that label because we're interested in how it affects the child to be treated as a weapon.
Hmm.
Because domestic violence folks, they often stop short. They're just they look at those behaviors and then they don't look at what happens.
Right.
And when we do the research, we call it those parental alienating behaviors because we
Hmm.
want to see what consequence that has on the child. But we are talking about the same behaviors. We are
Hmm.
talking about abusive parents.
Right.
And we're not talking about some strange different thing. Okay.
Right. Right.
And so, because I guarantee you, most of you, if you're an alienated parent, you left that relationship because it was probably very abusive in some way, psychologically abusive, physically
Mm.
abusive. It wasn't healthy. And that's probably good because if you stayed in that relationship, that's not a good context to raise a child, right? I mean, it's sometimes people just don't do well together and you need
Right.
to move on, get out of that relationship. However, it's really hard if you're with a parent that you know is very abusive and has maybe some personality problems or trauma from their past that they have not resolved.
Right.
Then it's really hard to leave because you know you're leaving your child in that situation. And
Right.
unless you have your, you know, things stacked in the right way, it's going to be very challenging to maintain a healthy environment for that child. You know, that I think that's one of the biggest challenges for people who, you know, like myself, you know, I've been a victim of domestic violence and my children are not alienated from their father. You know,
Right.
they love their father. They still want to see him. They don't even know about what happened.
Hmm.
I never told him. I never told them. And they don't need to know because they love their father. And as long as they see him and they are safe, they can maintain a relationship. But it's done within a structured court order that protects them from harm, but they still have a relationship. And I made sure of that. In fact, I probably am overly I probably did it, you know, but I'm very sensitive to that because it's so important that's half the child's identity.
Right.
And you can't just dictate for them. You can help teach them that when they get older and they go and want to have a relationship with this parent, I want them to have the knowledge and understanding that nobody's perfect and
Right.
your dad isn't perfect and he had some issues, but
Right.
still loves you, you know?
Yeah.
And that's so important for children, even no matter what kind of divorce or separation you have, is
Hmm.
to make the child feel like the other person didn't abandon you and that didn't they don't hate you or that they, you know, that they're safe, or at least when they see them, they're safe, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of the alienating parents don't do that, right?
Right.
They will take advantage of his parent who's compromised and use that against them. They will
Hmm.
create something to make them look like they're compromised, even though they're not,
Hmm.
because they're abusive, right? And that's what abusive people do.
I want you brought up an interesting thing that just came up recently in my instance, and it's happened more than once. As an advocate, as someone who said, okay, this isn't going to work, but I can't fight you in court every single day, and this is happening at such a high rate. What is it that I felt like I needed to do something? So I do a podcast. I became an advocate And I know people in your field don't like to consider themselves advocates because you're about facts and science. So I understand that you're not an advocate is usually someone who takes a certain subject matter or something to advocate towards that, but you deal in the realm of truth, science, and research.
Mhm.
So, you know, when you said, my kids don't even know, how old are your children, if you can tell us?
Today they are 13 and 12.
Okay, so still fairly young. Mine are 8 and 4.
Mhm.
And what would you say? You mentioned that alienating parent will use any sort of indiscrepancies. Meanwhile, they have their own
Mhm. Mhm.
against you in a courtroom.
Right.
This was thrown. This was the only thing that they talked about was my advocacy in my podcast.
Mhm.
What would you say as a mother now who said, I don't alienate, I encourage the relationship.
Mhm.
There are some things you disagree with. I'm sure your husband disagrees with some things about you, but how you stated how valuable it is. When the court's using your research and your work, and you're on, let's say you're on my podcast, you're on YouTube, you are talking about these things. You mentioned that you've gone through this. It's
Mhm.
it's it's documented in other things. You know, are you worried that your children at an appropriate age would see these types of things and the truth would destroy them, or the lies would destroy them?
Right. That's a good point. That's a good question. My children, they know a little bit, right? They know that their father has a mental illness. They don't know really what that means because they're not old enough to.
Right.
But at the same, so there's a certain level of honesty. But I know some people they justify telling their kids really inappropriate things, saying that they
Sure.
need to know the truth. No, they don't.
Sure.
And there's a
Sure.
lot of things they'll never have to know because it's just between me and their dad.
Right.
They don't
Right.
need to know it because that's a parent-child boundary that
Certain conversations,
you would
certain
never tell
actions.
a child certain things.
Yeah.
And even if they wanted to when they're an adult, I don't think I would tell them. I would say no because it would change your opinion of your dad in a way that why like
Right.
there's no reason for you to know this. And but and so they know enough. I mean, if they were to watch this, I'm not revealing a lot of things on the show,
No,
right?
you're having a discussion.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah.
and I've done the same thing.
Right.
And unfortunately, the courts and the attorneys and the alienating parents use these things.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and they'll often do that. I mean, I've seen that. I know I have friends who've written books, and then that's gotten used against them. Even though the books weren't nasty, I mean, they were just like kind of describing what had been going on. They were very factual, and they were just describing. They even had lawyers look it over and make sure it
Yeah.
looked okay.
Well, they call this
But-
disparaging the court or disparaging the other parent
right,
because
right,
we're having a conversation
right,
about factual things that are occurring.
right, right. Well, you got to realize that and that's a tough challenge for any parent who wants to speak out, or
Mhm.
anybody who wants to speak out about their victimization, right? I
Right.
mean, you're a victim of domestic violence, is what you are, and when you speak
Right.
up about it, people then abusive people will use that against you.
Sure.
So it is a challenge, and I think it's important to still stay strong and say no. This is just me. I mean, there is a line where you probably have to find ways to protect your children from seeing it, but alienators will probably show it to them. So
Yeah, and I mean, at the
you
end
can't
of the day,
control what
my
they're going
my
to
my
do.
my 8 and 4 year old aren't hopping on YouTube looking for what I advocate about. Now, is the abuser or the alienator really just trying to hide the truth? Is that really why they're saying, look, he's talking about it, or she's
Right,
talking about it? Like the kids, it's going to hurt the kids if they see it.
right.
You know.
Well, there's always deflection, right? I mean,
Mhm.
anybody who alienates, that's one of the symptoms, or any abuser,
And projection.
they deny responsibility. That's part of the abusive dynamic.
Sure.
And so, you could be doing nothing and they're going to find something wrong, right? And so,
Right. And I got
nobody's perfect. So anything you do wrong is going to be used. So if you don't speak up, they're going to find something else.
I got in trouble for leaving my kids for 4 hours with their grandmother while I worked.
Yeah.
And they twisted it like
Mhm.
when he has the kids every other weekend, he leaves them and doesn't stay with them.
Mhm. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could burn the potatoes and then the kids say
Daddy
You're
burnt the
poisoning
French
them.
fries.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can't cook. They want to go over there. I mean, that's where that trivial reasons for rejection are there. And, the reasons for children, I mean, you got to realize they're scrambling for some reason to reject you. They're
Right.
trying to find something to explain why they, because what the alienator does is in my most recent paper, we review kind of the impact
Mhm.
of alienation on children, or what these behaviors do.
Right.
And what happens, I mean, they're intended to make the child feel unloved, abandoned, and to make the child feel like you're not safe.
Mm.
And this goes against all their experiences with you, right?
Mhm.
This goes against their memories that they've had of you,
Right.
the attachment that they had.
Mhm.
So for kids, I mean, how do they reconcile this, right? I mean, they have they're being told things, and they start to not trust their own memories anymore. They don't
Right.
trust the feelings. They have to disconnect themselves, and they feel very hurt because, I mean, kids already feel hurt when parents divorce and
Right.
separate. And it's up to the parents to make that child still know that that other parent loves them, even though they're not there.
Mhm.
But alienators don't do that. And so then the kids then have to they get angry, right? I mean, who doesn't? Anytime there's a
Right.
breakup,
Yeah.
people get angry.
Yeah.
That's part of the grief cycle, right?
Mhm.
But children never grieve beyond that. They're not allowed to. And so that grief cycle, they're stuck on the anger, and then they're going to try to find any reason
Mhm.
to keep you away because they're hurting so bad, right?
Right.
And so that's why, if there's any grain of truth to what mom or dad is saying about them, about the other parent,
Mhm.
that it rings true to them because they remember something, but then it gets warped, right? It gets, blown out of proportion. And then the
Mhm.
child will start to believe that and start filling in the gaps with their own
Right.
memory. Um, and that's a tragic part, because then they start constructing this new narrative about you that's not even close to what
Oh,
really the
sure.
relationship has
Sure.
been like.
And they're protecting probably their behavior from being exposed as well, because they only want one side of the coin to be shown.
Right, right. Yep. Exactly. And they'll control the narrative. It's very one-sided. But when you're looking at the behaviors of the dynamics of this type of abuse, it's very similar to what we call coercively controlling abuse,
Mhm.
otherwise known as intimate terrorism. They're
Mhm.
they're the same name for the same
Mhm.
thing. Um, and that kind of abuse is different than other kinds of abuse. It's where you have one person who's primarily the perpetrator of the
Yeah.
behaviors. They have more power in the family system. I just had a paper accepted last week that's just got published, where we show that these families that are being alienated, that power dynamic is very imbalanced,
Mhm.
where the targeted parent or the alienated parent has no control and no power. Right, the other
Mhm.
parent controls everything.
Right.
If you want to see your kids, if you want to talk to them, if you want to have any, they control access. They control everything that you have. They control the
Em
narrative, and so
Emotional well-being
yeah, so
of
you
the
have
children and the other parent. You're
yeah,
wielding the most precious weapon
yep,
that should be the most precious thing to both of you, and
yeah,
you're literally using them to destroy the other parent, because
mhm,
inside that other parent is destroyed.
yeah. Yeah, I've seen so many parents, like, they'll make allowances because they know what's happening to their kid, and they'll say no, but then they end up losing their rights. They lose decision making. They lose more and more power over time, and more control. And that's because that's what motivates
Mhm.
abusive people.
Mhm. What
Power
do
and
you
control. Power and control is what motivates them.
and fear, right?
Yeah.
Fear?
Well, because yeah, they fear losing that, right?
Right.
So if a lot of their anxieties, especially if it's tied to pathologies, like narcissism or borderline, or some other disorder, their anxieties get triggered anytime there's a threat. And
Mhm.
so the way that they cope with that is by trying to control the things around them to
Mhm.
make their life feel more in
Right.
control.
Yeah.
But that's a very abusive dynamic that the child is then stuck with.
Right. You need to
Um,
learn a healthier way to cope with your anxieties.
right, right. And so the child then is taking care of that parent because the parent is unable to really meet the needs of the child. So
Mm.
that's why you see these kids, a lot of them becoming what we call parentified, or
Uh,
they're treated like an adult, even though they're not. They're allowed to choose things that you would never
choice.
let a kid choose.
No,
Should
I don't
never.
give my kids many choices.
Yeah. I know.
Not right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a horrible thing to put a child, especially when the child has been disconnected from their feelings and their
Mm,
memories, right? If they become alienated, and not all children become alienated, fortunately,
right.
but if they do, you know, their feelings are not very authentic, because they've been so cut off from their experience, and
Yeah.
they don't trust their own experiences with you, so.
What does your research tell you about the attributes of an alienator as far as what typically can we determine, like if the courts did start accepting this research and going, all right, well, we need to include this because this is abuse, spousal, child, intimate partner abuse, whatever. What are typically the behaviors, the behavioral disorders, and or the history of an alienating parent?
Well, it's going to be a slippery slope to go down if you're trying to show this in court.
Right.
And I say this because not everybody who has personality disorders or other things alienates their children,
Hmm.
right? And so if somebody's always trying to prove that this person's sick or they're all these things, that's important from a treatment perspective, right? If you're going to go and treat this parent, you need to know what's wrong with them, right?
Hmm.
But from arguing your case in court, while it is useful information, it doesn't mean that that person is necessarily engaging in behaviors.
Right.
What has to be shown there are these behaviors occurring and causing or related to the child's alienation from you, because that's the child abuse, right? And that's the sadly, it's domestic violence. I mean, the motive behind it is domestic violence,
Right. Right.
but in
They're
court,
not
if you talk about that, they think you're just focusing on yourself and you're not
right.
focusing on your
And
kid.
or you don't want to pay child support. That's why you want to have equal custody. You
Right.
know, and again, you talked about it being intimate partner terrorism. Describe that term a little bit more and how it separates from intimate partner violence, and then it has its own term. What is the difference?
Right. So within the domestic violence research, there are different types of violence. Violence is very complicated. It can be very nuanced. But generally, there are two basic forms that scientists have found. One of them is this intimate terrorism. That's when you think about battery, right? You have a batterer and a victim. You see power imbalances where
Hmm.
one's more powerful than the other. Typically, you see the assumptions about that kind of battery are that it's usually the male perpetrator and a female victim,
Hmm.
even though the statistics nationwide don't show that.
Right.
Nationwide, we find no gender or very small gender differences.
Right. Right. Right.
It's negligible in terms of stalking, sex abuse, and physical violence. Men and women, similar levels, proportions
Right.
nationwide. But when you take small samples from like shelters, which of course pretty much only service women,
Service women. Yeah.
then of course it looks like there's a lot more women who
You're
are
cherry picking a little bit.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. So sampling, you always have to look at what's the sample of what they're reporting. Who
Hmm.
are they actually surveying?
Yeah.
Get that statistic. Otherwise, it gets very misleading,
Right.
and people misuse statistics in that regard.
Right.
But when you look at national statistics, we don't see, at least in the United States and in many parts of Europe, we don't see those gender differences. Now,
Okay.
it's different in other countries,
Hmm.
so I'm not going to say that that's true everywhere in the world. Like Ethiopia, it's very different. Right?
Yeah.
And so in South Africa, it's very different.
Yeah.
So now there's another kind of violence just called situational couple violence. And this is actually more common. So a lot of violence involves people just using aggression in their fighting,
Hmm.
right? So there's not this power dynamic and need to control and dominate.
Right.
It's more like two people who have like anger problems and don't know how
Just
to communicate very
just responding to
yeah,
each other.
they start yelling, throwing stuff, get out of here, and
Yeah.
it's just, and it's like this tit for tat thing
Yeah.
where they're
Yeah.
both just
My dad
nitpicking,
my dad
fighting.
calls it he said, she said.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the back and forth.
And it's very different. It's where both people kind of have similar levels of power,
Mhm.
right? They're using aggression just as a way to stop a fight or to kind of end the argument or to win that one argument,
Yeah,
right?
to
It's
be
not
heard.
right. Yeah, to hear they're not so and so the way we treat that kind of violence is different because it involves, two people who can't communicate very well and who need maybe some ways to cope with stress and
Yeah.
conflict resolution skills and
Mhm.
couples communication and that, like I mentioned, that's a much more common form of aggression and violence.
Mhm.
I think half of college students it's characterized by that. It's
Mhm.
really high rates of violence, but it's not that battery kind of violence that you think about.
Right.
And in fact, yeah, that kind of battery or intimate terrorism, or it's more today the term is coercive controlling abuse.
Yeah.
It's different. It's patterned. It's predictable. It's one person primary perpetrator, the other person responding.
Right.
It's not like both people are, proactively doing it.
Right, right, right.
And
There's that.
so and so that's why and so in my research I've been trying to say, well, what is parental alienation? Which one does it resemble?
Mhm.
And across like I think at least now 6 different studies, I personally have empirical evidence showing it's intimate terrorism,
Right.
coercively controlling
It's
abuse.
one parent typically dominating or trying to control the other parent using the children.
Yes. And it matches. I mean, I have a book chapter that's coming out in a new book by Oxford University Press. It should come out this year, but where my co-author and I, Edward Crook, we detail the domestic violence research. We like the behaviors, the characteristics of the perpetrator,
Mhm.
and the outcomes on the parents,
Mhm.
and they're identical. Like all the results across parental alienation research, domestic violence research, they're the same because we're
Right.
talking about the same thing. We just have
Right.
a different name for it.
Right, right.
And so to deny that there's parental alienation means, and it's very odd because it just, in fact, we have a paper now that we're about to publish, which I can't wait to talk about pretty soon. But we find that it's the parents who were alienating their children that were more likely to have other kinds of abuse. So other kinds
Themselves.
so
Their own
child
childhood
abuse,
abuse.
domestic abuse. They've had findings, meaning like a police or somebody, we found that they were the ones who were more likely to have abuse claims.
Oh.
So by denying that, or by saying it's the victim of parental alienation, the parent,
Mm.
that they're the abusive one is actually not supported in the scientific research, and it's supported the other way around.
Yeah,
And
they like to call parental alienation junk science. And I'm like,
yeah,
"Really?" Because it's
yeah.
like it's happening. You can see it. So
Well,
how is it not science?
it's ridiculous because there's been like over 1,000 scholarly papers and scientific studies published on the
Yeah.
topic in countries all over the world, like Brazil, other languages. I publish in the top psych journals.
Mhm.
I mean, top
You're like,
psych science journals.
kind
And
of a big deal. That was Jennifer Harman not being not being modest. Thank God. Your work is important. I don't want you to be modest. I want you to be boastful.
well, I mean, if you look, I mean, I think that's what's the most important thing is, trying to, this scientists recognize science and they don't evaluate it with ideological blinders.
Yes, real science.
When they review it. Now, some journals don't do that, right? Some
Sure.
journals are not science journals. They're journals for professionals, and they tend to have more, or there might be have an advocacy angle to them. And so
Political. Yeah.
publish isn't necessarily, what I would consider good science,
Yeah.
but, and sometimes, you'd want to publish in a place where the audience that's going to read it, you want certain people to read what you're going to do.
Sure.
But, I'm always very careful, especially because I'm somebody who's experienced both domestic violence and witnessing parental alienation, in my husband's relationship,
Mm.
with his children. so whenever I do research, I'm always very careful in my designs to be as, to protect, try to minimize bias as much as possible.
Yeah.
Make sure that my research team are comprised of other people
Right.
who've not been alienated, who
Hmm.
come at it from a different perspective.
Right.
So I always publish with different people. If you see
Right.
anything I publish with, I select people who, on purpose, who bring with them a different perspective, and typically have not been alienated themselves.
You're not trying to push an opinion. You're trying to get to the bottom of the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I even had a reviewer once say, it was the worst review I ever had.
Those are the best.
And a year ago, or a year later, I turned it around to a different journal and they accepted it right away.
Yeah.
But this reviewer said, "Oh, this is just advocacy research." I was like, "Well,
What does that even mean? Okay, that's
ridiculous."
good. That's fine.
Well, it's fine if people want to use it for advocacy.
Yeah,
That's
but
not what
okay.
I'm not, I don't have an agenda I'm trying to push. My agenda is to do good research, right? And to make sure that bad research, call it out if you see it,
And to help humanity
Yeah.
through science. That's why science exists.
Right.
It's to further the human experience
Yeah.
in a beneficial way. That's why we have science.
Right. Exactly.
You mentioned in and we sort of dove into the intimate partner violence and all that stuff. And in that video, which I'm going to play just a little clip of it, but we sort of jumped into it and conversating before I played it. But this was you actually in Athens, and this was probably one of the best videos I've seen of not only yours but regards to parental alienation. And hopefully they won't block my podcast because I'm sharing this, but I can always clip it out and then redo it. But this is you talking about parental alienation as a form of family violence. I'm going to play just a short clip of it, and then I have a few questions about what I watched in this video. I watched this video 3 times before we did the interview because I had so many things that I wanted to touch on, not only from my personal experience, but through my advocacy of parents that are reaching out to me saying, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And this event that you spoke at, I mean, this is a very complete video. This is great work that you did. This is just a great tool for anyone to listen to. But I'm going to play a short clip real quick.
However, that only captures part of a much larger picture. In a recent paper that I published with Edward Crook that he referred to in his talk, we stated that parental alienation or parental alienating behaviors are a form of family violence because they can be both child abuse and intimate partner violence. Therefore, family violence is an umbrella term that we use for these 2 forms of violence. I'm going to focus now mostly on intimate partner violence in my talk. When we think about intimate partner violence, we often think about intimate terrorism, where there's a powerful perpetrator of abuse who uses psychological and physically abusive behaviors to control and dominate the less powerful person. This type of abuse is not likely to be reciprocated. We might see some aggressive behaviors of the target of the abuse out of self-defense or anger, but the abusive behaviors are typically seen in the more powerful partner, and it's a larger strategy of that partner to maintain control of the other person. This form of intimate partner violence has predictable cycles of abuse, with increases in tension and strain, followed by aggressive behaviors, followed by a honeymoon phase, and the cycle repeats. The perpetrators of intimate terrorism often have severe personality disorders and/or a history of abuse in their family of origin. A more common form of intimate partner violence is called situational couple violence.
And so we talked about that. That was my clip, and then we just sort of dove into it. So, but I wanted to play that clip because I want people to go to that particular clip. So, go to this YouTube video. I just typed Jennifer Harman parental alienation, and it's literally I think the 2nd or 3rd video. Your first video, of course, is your TED Talk or your TEDx talk, which was the first one that I saw. But this one was absolutely outstanding. So go to this YouTube video and watch this when you guys get a chance. But one of the things that you were talking about as the video sort of goes forward is um, the behaviors, things that we typically see.
Right.
A few of those that I want to mention that I've experienced, which if I've experienced it, millions of others have experienced it. But was certain things like moving, like relocating, moving further away, isolating the child. Was things like frequent doctor visits, seeking medical attention, seeking you use the phrase only you know only the alienating parent can care for this sick child that's just
Mhm.
struggling, and the other parent, whether he or she is at work all the time or is just not the main doctor visit person, doesn't know what's going on, and they're not equipped to deal with it. And you find that a lot of kids are, being used. They're not as sick. We get into things like, I don't know, you didn't mention in that video, but are you finding anything? You mentioned the term sociopath as I guess a greater evil from the personality disorders.
Mhm.
But are we getting into in any of these instances where these kids are being taken to the doctors profusely? They're being diagnosed with behavioral conditions. Many times, if they are true, it's due to the lack of parental involvement, or that chaos and trauma that they're going through. But the kids are suffering from things like ADHD, anxiety, depression at
Mhm.
8 years old.
Yeah.
I was an 8-year old that wasn't depressed.
Yeah.
My parents fought and they were married, but for the most part,
Right.
I had a pretty decent childhood. It wasn't perfect. My divorced parents were in the room in court together
Mhm.
because that's what parents who shouldn't be together do after they separate. They do the best thing for the children,
Right.
and they
Well, that would
they they
be,
work.
yeah. And that would be what we would describe, not parental alienation, but that would be kind of more of what we describe as more of a loyalty conflict, where you
Right.
have two parents. And that situation resembles more that situational couple violence that I talked about
Hmm.
in that video, where you have two parents who don't get along. They can actually sit in a courtroom and come to an agreement. They
Yeah.
can mediate because they were just using aggression as a way to, kind of solve an argument,
Right.
because and they're usually not as pathological. They don't have the same
And
kind of
and
trauma.
when they separate, my dad even said, he goes, it's crazy when you get this age how you look back, and he goes, a lot of the crazy stuff and terrible things are kind of funny. Not that they were funny at the time,
Yeah,
but they were having this conversation, and I was like, that's good stuff.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's good that
yeah.
it's sad that they couldn't work it out then, but
Mhm.
they definitely participate more with each other and in my life going through these things that I'm going through as well.
Right.
But, my fear, as many other parents are, especially with the medical stuff, parents who are seeking medical diagnoses for, benefits.
Mhm.
ADHD and autism and anxiety disorders come with more social security money. They come with more disability checks. Like you said, it's also a way to control the child,
Mhm.
by taking the doctors frequently and doing all that, as well as, like I said, the relocation aspect of it, and a parent who quickly uses a new spouse or partner against the other.
Right.
Getting married. My ex got married 5 days before our trial this week in a courtroom, and
Mhm.
they moved 4 weeks before, 30 miles away. And my kids have been seeing the dentist frequently for what I believe, this is my opinion, for neglect of their dental hygiene. Their baby teeth are getting infected. They're
Right.
having to be extracted. There's things going on, and as a father who's unable to really have a court system work in his benefit, but I'm not crazy, as the judge thinks I have mental illness. He told me that he thinks that I need to get evaluated. One, he's not an expert, so
Mhm.
I reject your request. I submitted that I would be willing to, but I'd like it bilateral.
Mhm.
I'm willing to do anything that she's willing to do as long as I can have more time with my children.
Right.
And when I went in that courtroom, it was like you would have thought. I mean, the way they responded was that, no, you're the crazy one. We're
Right.
not going to give you any more
Well,
time with your kids.
I mean, what's disturbing about that is that there's a lack of recognition that what families are bringing to that courtroom
Education
is
wise.
what they're bringing is a family system problem. And you
Hmm.
don't just point the finger at one person and say, you're the problem,
Uh-huh.
right? It's like when they say, okay, let's just put the kid in therapy and they'll learn how to cope with the situation.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the behaviors of the parent don't stop, so
Right.
they're still. I use the analogy with all the people I work with as you can't treat an alcoholic in the bar.
If
You
you're
have
not
to.
changing the environment or what
You
they're
got
being
to change the
exposed to.
environment. Yeah.
Yeah,
If the kid's in an abusive environment, it's never going to stop. And you were
exactly.
bringing up all the externalizing behaviors, and we definitely see that a lot with young children who are going through alienation. And I mean, you imagine the amount of pain that they're experiencing and the grief that they can't have and they
Hmm.
can't openly express.
Oh, I cried.
And so they can't openly express it. And
Mm.
so what is the kid going to do? Like where do they put it? Where do they put that? Right. So of course they're going to act out. Of course they're going to act out that way.
Hmm.
And it's so sad because for people who don't know what's going on in the background, they attribute it to ADHD or some other problem.
Yeah.
And that might be going on, but it was probably exasperated by the
Hmm.
situation. And until that situation and the family problem and that dynamic and system is fixed, it's hard to know what's actually going on with the kid. What do they really need help with versus what does the family need help with?
Right.
And and as kids get older, sometimes you'll still see that externalizing, but you'll see it start to internalize because they're trying to cognitively cope with it and they have the capacity to cope with it better, right? Because they're able to do a little bit more mental gymnastics to, to
Hmm.
kind of figure out. And
Yeah.
and then you'll see them internalize it more. So then you're going to see more anxiety and depression. And they'll turn it inward rather than doing it out, you know. And that's the tragic part for people who don't know what this family dynamic is. They will label that wrong, and
Hmm.
alienating parents then can kind of get away with it. And then I think it's always crazy that they can get away with saying, "Oh, look, they haven't seen dad or mom in like 6 months, and it's getting worse." It's like, well, if they haven't seen you in 6 months,
Well, and that's the
yeah,
thing,
it's not getting worse because of them. It's getting worse because they're in your only care, right? Um,
Jennifer, they, in my instance and in many court, I'm not the only one. My court's not special. I'm pretty sure. They said, my kids were in therapy, and at one, I didn't know about it.
mhm,
They've been seeing a therapist. Judge didn't care.
yeah,
During my closing argument, I said, Your Honor, it's my belief, and not only my belief, but it's evidence and education that
mhm,
tells me that when you have kids seeing one parent 26 days a month and the other 4,
mhm,
to have an attorney and the other parent blaming the other parent for being inconsistent when he or she is only getting 4 nights a month.
right,
I said that is absurd.
right, yep,
That's illogical.
mhm,
So you're saying that a parent can destroy a kid in 4 visits, in
yeah,
4 nights a month. You're messing up sleep patterns because they're staying up late because you only have them on the weekends, so you might stay up till 11,
right, right,
and you might not have eating times. And there's certain things that these parents are throwing in there that are like,
mhm,
that's not a thing. We just parent differently. That's not
right,
abuse. That's not
right.
inconsistency.
And and trying to make the argument that it's not in their best interest because it's not consistent. Well, it's not in their best interest to lose the relationship.
Who's
And that's
who's
the most
creating the
that's the
inconsistency?
most important. Yeah, the thing that's consistent is the time with you.
The relationship,
That
not the house.
the quality time with you is the most important thing. Because
Absolutely.
there's no way you can maintain an attachment to a parent without
No.
having time, and quality time. And so that's the tragic piece of it is a lot of times people don't see that, or they just think, oh, we have to move slowly.
What do you think,
No.
as someone, like you mentioned, as someone who is a victim of domestic violence, who still includes their children's father, and who advocates out loud, what is it that you would suggest? And this is a hard question, maybe, and you might not have the answer, but
Mhm.
what do parents like me do who are Been doing it. I'm 2.5 years in now. I'm broke. I proceed this last time. There's some other fighting I can do, but literally I've put my life and
Mhm,
potential on hold.
mhm,
I'm a singer songwriter, and at I wanted to live in Nashville when my kids were born, and we tried that a couple times, but it unfortunately with the partner that I had, it wasn't working. What would you suggest? What do we do? Do we keep fighting in court? Do we give up? If you can't beat the system and you can't beat the alienating parent, and your answer is probably going to be it's hard. You got to make that decision.
yeah.
What do you do? What do we do, Jennifer?
Right. Uh, well, yeah, yeah. The answer is it's hard.
Yeah.
But it's well, a lot depends. I mean, you have to pick your battles. You have to know which when's the timing. Unfortunately, this is true for coercively controlling abuse. Is sometimes you have to show the pattern over time to
Mhm.
show that, and that's the same thing with alienation. You have to show these patterns of behaviors over time, which really is horrible because if you're a victim of that,
Means you have to allow for the abuse
you have
to
to like
gather
wait it out,
to
right?
gather evidence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then and during that time, your kids are in there, and your relationship is suffering, that's the hardest part of this is that until we can kind of start recognizing this as another form of family violence and treat it like that, treat it as a child protection issue.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, right now, then, until that happens, you have to build your case. You can't just go at every little thing and try to fight it because you'll exhaust yourself and you'll have no money and it's not
Yeah.
worth it because the court won't see it.
Right.
Right. And sadly, I get involved in cases and I don't want to have to get involved in cases, but I
No.
ended up getting involved in cases, but people bring me on at the end because it's gotten so bad. That's the only time you can really finally go in and prove your case. It's
Uh-huh.
gotten so bad,
Uh-huh.
and there's not as much prevention then. And there could be so much more done at the earlier stages, like triaging these families. When they file for divorce, we can screen people and say, well, this one's a red flag, right?
Right.
And then get the right kind of intervention because they will not mediate. Just
Yeah.
like with batterers, you would never expect somebody who's a victim of battery to go in and do mediation.
Yeah,
Because
you mentioned in that video you wouldn't ask someone who's being bullied to go in a room with their bully and mediate and work it out.
right,
You're it's I
right,
don't think they understand the the pathology
right,
of
right,
what's going on here.
right. Yeah, and and not all cases where there's alienation even are like severe, right? I mean,
Mhm.
some parents are amenable to change, right? But we need intervention to figure out who those are. We need to show like we need to kind of get in there and do the right types of intervention, just like when let's say CPS gets a call. The way that
Mm.
they're set up, they're supposed to respond with, if you have mild cases, you don't just throw the kids in foster care. You're
Right.
supposed to do some, family support. You do some education. You might do some, checking in with the family, and then you kind of get progressively more intensive as the abuse gets more severe. And
Right.
that's what's considered best practice for parental alienation.
Yeah.
But the trick is legally, you have to show that it's child abuse. You have to show that this kid is being, hurt in this way.
Mm.
And there are some courts who get it. There are some that don't, and there's some judges who totally understand it.
Mhm.
And I mentioned this kind of anecdote on another podcast recently, but about 2 years ago, I got an email from a judge that I've worked with down in Australia, and he wrote it to me in the middle of the night for him, and he was just heartbroken because he had to put an order in for a family that he knew was the wrong order. Like
Oh.
he's read everything on alienation. He's been to conferences. Like no judges go to conferences on alienation.
Yeah.
He's been to them. He flew from Australia to the US to go and see talks, and he's read everything.
Yeah.
But the lawyers did not present evidence that he
Oh.
could use in his opinion.
We need to get it out of the legal
So
realm.
yeah, so he wanted to make the right decision. But he couldn't because the lawyers didn't present what he needed. And if he did put anything in that order that hadn't been presented in the case, it could be appealed and it would just
Sure.
be, sent down to him. And sent back. And so a lot of times I think we don't understand that the process, the way the system is set up, a lot of the people who are players in that system, their roles are very constricted.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things they can't even do if they wanted to. And there's
Mm-hmm.
some that abuse the system. There's others who don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's why it's just such a nightmare, because, you don't know by the luck of the draw which judge you're going to get, what their background is.
Sure.
If your lawyer has never litigated an alienation case, I guarantee chances are it's going to get screwed up, sadly.
Yeah.
Every time I work on a case, I always have to do so much education to try to make sure they understand what they're dealing with, and how to argue their case. And I'm not a lawyer, so
Yeah.
I usually refer them to a book that I told you about. My good friend Ashish Joshi is.
Yeah, I'm going to put those books up as well.
Alienation. This is my recent read that I just got through. It's a
So
great
these were three of the books that you had mentioned to me that are must reads. You're not trying to promote or anything like that, but these are on your book list.
Money on these.
Yeah. These are what you told me before the podcast as suggested reading to parents like myself and even attorneys and judges, which is Parental Alienation, Science and Law, The Respondent, which just came out with Greg Ellis, who you did a podcast with or an interview with, which I need to watch. That is that on YouTube currently?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Great. I will find that after and go to the gym and watch that. And then Litigating Parental Alienation was the book you just held up. Are these tools that you can share within a courtroom dynamic and have that used?
The Parental Alienation Science and Law book, it's a compilation of a lot of chapters. This is the book.
Yeah.
And they're organized around the 5-factor model, which is a model that's used to differentiate alienation cases from other kinds of family conflict.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a way to diagnose, but it's a way to help the court understand the data that they're looking at.
Right.
And this is how, and the Litigating Parental Alienation book is also a way that it describes how you do that.
Mm-hmm.
So how you present your evidence, like what kinds of things can you enter in and what can't you, and you essentially want to show support for the 5-factor model to make it undeniable that you're dealing with an alienation case and not a loyalty conflict case, or not estrangement, which would be where a child has a justified reason for rejecting you. And so when you present that stuff in the correct way, and you built your whole case around that, and there's science to back all that up, right? So the book that I showed, the Science and Law book, details the research studies that you need to kind of lend empirical support. So it's not a clinical opinion; these are scientific opinions,
right,
about how we rule out these cases, right? And you don't need a psychologist to diagnose alienation in your case. A judge can decide this. And in fact, even in Canada, back in April, there was a case where the court took judicial notice of alienation being child abuse.
Okay.
What that means is that means that they recognize it as child abuse, and they didn't need an expert to come in and explain it.
Right. They've heard about it. They've checked out the research. Yes, they agree with it.
No need to waste our court time anymore.
Right.
And amazing, right? That was just 2 months ago. Right? So, I mean,
to me, it's a no-brainer, really. But again, like you said, there's those who are protecting their industry, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's definitely that. And, but, hopefully, I've worked on cases where sometimes, people are able to settle out of court. I wouldn't say that they mediate.
Right. Yeah.
It's an alienation case.
They don't speak kindly to each other during the process.
No. Well,
they probably don't speak very much.
I mean, what they're, if you're in an alienation case, they're motivated to maintain control and power. And so that's why they're not going to mediate. They'll appear to mediate to get an advantage over you. And then they'll use that, they'll drain you of financial resources while you're trying to mediate. Because that's another abusive strategy, right?
Yeah.
Financial abuse. And then take you to court and, wear you down, the idea is to keep wearing you down and drain you for all your money
I
so you can't fight anymore. And
luckily I think I have hyperactive disorder or something, anxiety. I don't know. I've got full of energy. So
yeah.
Jennifer, tell us before we end the broadcast. Obviously, go check out those books. You have a few. You said you have a few articles and papers coming out that you're getting ready to publish.
Yeah, I have 2 that were just published over the last 3 weeks. Problem is, a lot of them they're not open access, meaning like you can't just get them, right? You know, you have to go through.
Right. They're not at Barnes and Noble. They're in clinical
Right.
journals.
Yeah, because the way, scientific journals, they kind of, they like to make money. And
Yeah.
but if you want the original, I can't post it. So I can't, in other words, I can't post my articles on a web
Okay.
page where anybody can get it.
Okay.
However, you can email me directly and I
Sweet.
can share it.
I will do that.
Like if I'm teaching, for example, I can share it in a classroom. I just can't do it publicly. But one paper was looking at, it was a review of the impact of alienation on children and the kinds of losses that they experience.
Yeah.
The other paper that we just came out is looking at the power dynamics in these families, and trying to see, what does it resemble intimate terrorism or does it resemble situational couple violence? And surprise, surprise, it was the former.
Yeah.
And so, and I think what's interesting about that one too is the more custody an alienated parent had, it was related to more challenging behaviors of the alienator, meaning that they were setting up situations like games of chicken, like where they would set up a situation where the parent had only like 2 choices. Like, let's say you're
And they're both terrible.
Yeah, they're both bad. Like you go to a soccer game and you're like in front of all the other parents and they yell at you about something and you're like, what do you do? Do you walk away?
Right.
Do you talk back? And then there's all these witnesses, and if you walk away, they say, "Oh, look at you," and then
it's an entrapment game.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and they're very good at doing that. And we found that that's very common. And it seems to be, and we got to explore this more, but it seems to be that that's a mechanism that's used by alienating parents to get more control and power. Making allegations of abuse that you have no choice but to respond to, right?
Yeah.
And they'll make all sorts of these kinds of situations. And so that's the fascinating thing, is when you're going through your case and you're trying to show the alienating behaviors over time, look for those examples.
Oh man.
When you find those examples, you'll say, look, this person is trying to manipulate the situation. This isn't just a random situation. They created this situation to get control.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that shows the proactive nature of these behaviors. And I do want to mention, I know you mentioned gender before I go. I do mention that in my research, I don't find gender differences in who the perpetrator is, which resembles the other kinds of violence that we've been talking about.
Okay.
Like coercive controlling violence, men and women just as likely to be victims. And that's using national data.
Yeah.
In my study, using national data, we don't find gender differences. But where we do find gender differences is where in how moms and dads do it. That's because they just aggress differently. And that's the same in other kinds of violence. And so when it goes to court, you'll start to see differences in how it's handled because of biases in how they're perceived, right? You'll see allegations of abuse being more likely to believed by moms than dads.
Right.
You'll see, and so that's where the bias starts to really show, right? You'll start to see more people in the system, like dads, being affected.
Yeah.
And at the appellate level, we see that 70% of the cases where alienation was found are where the dad was the targeted parent.
Right.
30% were where the mom was. But that's, there could be a couple of reasons for that. It could be because they had the money to fight it, because it's very expensive to go to an appeal.
Yeah.
It also could be that there were just a lot of biases along the way that led to that.
Yeah.
We don't know that. I'm doing a study right now that's looking at that more. We're looking at trial level cases to see if we see this gender difference there. And so we do have a lot of research that we have to do to really explore this kind of gender piece of it.
Yeah.
But I think that's very important, because and we haven't even touched same-sex relationships.
Well,
Like,
you're getting into the systematic
right,
aspect of it, and is the system promoting the behavior? And of course it is, because it's feeding the trauma, which kids are then becoming parents who grew up in a system or a broken home, who it's just we're on a hamster wheel of
right,
trauma and dysfunction.
right.
And the courts keep making money, the lawyers are making money, the pharmaceutical companies are making money. So we're all drugged up and miserable, uh and such is the way society is moving now. There's many, obviously there's many ways that this isn't happening to everybody yet, but it is increasing. Has your research found out that there is an increase, a leveling out, decrease in this type of, obviously, with divorce and out of wedlock births are on the rise?
Mhm.
So is this on an increase?
That's a good question, and I don't know. It could, because a lot of people just don't know what it is, right?
Right.
So we don't know if, like, it shows like, oh my gosh, there's a lot more because people are learning what it is, but there's a lot of people who still don't understand it, and they say they're being alienated and they're not.
Right.
So there's a lot of people like, oh, I can't call my kid, every day, even though there's really no other, like the kid's just busy, or there's something else, and that doesn't mean they're being
Yeah.
alienated.
Yeah.
And so, I always have to kind of educate people. It's like, well, no, just because mom or dad doesn't want to change this weekend for the holiday doesn't mean you're being alienated.
Right. You're allowed to have boundaries.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's normal things that just come up that, you're going to disagree about with the other
Sure.
parent, or you're going to have some access problems sometimes, especially as
Yeah.
kids start to want to hang out with their friends. And it doesn't mean that we're talking about something different with alienation,
Hmm.
And so, but I do a lot of, it's clarifying that. And you can see some people going to court, and if the attorneys don't get it and they go in and argue alienation's going on and it's not,
Hmm.
um, and then the court believes it, then that's bad too. Like, that's like somebody saying that they were a victim of domestic violence and they're not.
Right. You're saying, hey, there's abuse going on here. And they're like, no, there's not. Keep paying your child support and
Right,
seeing your
right.
kid every other weekend.
So it goes
Yeah.
both ways. Moms and dads could claim both kinds of abuse, and either they don't know what it,
Or
so.
they think that if you're a man in particular, I'll just speak for myself. I need a psyche val
Yeah,
because I don't know why. I haven't needed a psyche val in 40 years.
right,
I
yeah,
might, I might have anxieties and stuff, but rightfully so.
right,
You
right.
know,
Yeah, a lot of times it's circumstantial, especially in family cases. It's
yeah, and judges
situational,
shouldn't be,
situational.
just a message to my judge. Don't tell parents that they need psyche valves. You're not an expert. You stick to the law, and if an expert comes in and thinks I need a psyche valve, then I'm happy to subject myself. But Jennifer, before we go, I know I said before we go last time, but before we go, what do you have coming up? What can you share with us? And I'll let you take it away and close us out.
Well, let's see what we have coming up. I've got a few papers that hopefully I'll be able to speak about soon, looking at other claims of abuse in alienation cases. I've got a paper evaluating a program for severely alienated children.
Oh,
And I've got a lot of other projects going on looking at specific alienating behaviors and how they're directly related to outcomes in children. We're looking at the impact of looking at different films for children, like a
ah,
movie like Erasing Family, which is a
yeah,
fantastic film.
I saw that.
Yeah, and so I'm in it, but
Yeah.
that's a
No, we
director.
did I was working with folks in that organization, and we had a premiere here in Chapel
Oh,
Hill, in
great.
a lot of North Carolina. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So we're looking at the impact that has on college students, and seeing like if it helps them maybe reach out to a parent after watching it and stuff.
Yeah.
So we're getting ready to do that here in the fall. And yeah, I mean, I just have lots of research projects I'm working on. So
Well, if you ever need any help, if you need an errand boy or anyone just to type for you,
okay.
I want to participate in any way I can. Unfortunately, I'm probably not going to go get a doctorate anytime soon. But I would love to have you back. And thank you so much. And I'll see you next time.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Jennifer, have a great night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.